Welcome to reading number 4 of History, Fiction, or Science, Chronology 1 by A.T. Fomenko. To review, last time, Fomenko went over the critics of the Scaligean chronology starting from the 16th century. Isaac Newton. Strangely enough, Newton died right around the time that a French publisher had published his criticisms of Scaligean chronology, against his wishes, by the way. He went over Nikolai and Alexandrovich Morozov and how he believed that he was the one who pioneered the work, although he seemed to believe that the chronology from the 6th century on was actually more or less intact. He did go over the historians who believe there's a 300-year problem. Guys like Illig and Niemitz. He also went over the problems there is with Roman chronology as we understand it, in how many characters couldn't possibly have been contemporaries who are claimed in the Scaliger version of chronology to be contemporaries. So we pick up in section 4 of chapter 1, the problems in establishing a correct chronology of, in quotes, ancient Egypt. The significant discrepancies between the chronological data offered by the ancient sources and the global chronology of the ancient times as devised in the 17th century arose in other areas as well. For instance, the establishment of the Egyptian chronology presented some substantial difficulties, since a great many documents contain chronological contradictions. Let us examine the correlation between the classical history by Herodotus and the Scaligean chronology. For instance, in his consecutive and coherent account of Egyptian history, Herodotus calls Cheops the successor of Rhampsinitos. The modern commentator will immediately, in quotes, correct in the following manner. Herodotus creates confusion in chronology of Egypt. Rhampsinitos, or Ramses II, was a king of the 19th dynasty, 1345 to 1200 BC, whereas Cheops belonged to the 4th, 2600 to 2480 BC. The discrepancy here equals 1200 years, no less. Just think of what the figure implies and of its sheer value. 1200 years. Let us carry on. According to Herodotus, Asychis was succeeded by Anisis. Modern commentary is also rash to tell us that the, quote, Herodotus leaps from the end of the 4th dynasty, about 2480 BC, to the beginning of the Ethiopian reign in Egypt, about 715 BC. The leap is of 1800 years. That's 1800 years. In general, it turns out that, quote, the chronology of kings given by Herodotus does not concur with that found in the fragments of Manetho's list of kings, unquote. As a rule, the chronology of Herodotus is much shorter than the Scaligean version. The time intervals between kings, according to Herodotus, are often thousands of years shorter than corresponding periods as given by Manathon. The history of Herodotus contains a great number of, quote, minor errors, unquote, those of 30 to 40 years. However, they only come to existence as a result of attempts to fit his history into the Scaligerian chronology. We quote a few of the numerous examples of such occurrences. The modern commentator tells us that, quote, Herodotus confuses King Sesostris with the king Psametrix I. Also, quote, Pittacus could not have met Croesus in 560 BC. By the way, Herodotus does not indicate the date in such terms. Since he died in 750 BC, unquote. Another event related by Herodotus is commented upon thusly, quote, It is an error made by Herodotus. Solon could not have met Croesus. But how can this be true? Herodotus devotes an entire page to relating the interactions between Croesus and Solon. Scaligerian chronology, on the other hand, tells us no such interactions ever took place. The commentators also accuse Herodotus of dating solar eclipses incorrectly. From pages 504, 534, and so on and so forth. We should note that the choice of one chronological version from several contradicting ones is far from simple. There had been a conflict between the so-called short and long chronologies of Egypt that were developed in the 19th century. The short chronology is the one currently used, but it still contains a great many contradictions which remain unresolved. The most prominent German Egyptologist, H. Brugsch, wrote, quote, When the reader inquires about whether any epochs and historical moments concerning the pharaohs can be considered to possess a finite chronological assessment, and when his curiosity makes him turn to the tables compiled by a great variety of scientists, he will be surprised to find himself confronted with a large number of opinions on the chronological calculations of the pharaoh era belonging to the representatives of the newest school. For instance, the German scientists date the ascension of Menes, the first Egyptian pharaoh, to the throne as follows. Boeck dates this event to 5702 BC, Unger to 5613 BC, Brugsch to 4455 BC, Leuth 4157 BC, Lepsius 3892 BC, Bunsen 3623 BC. The difference between the two extreme datings is mind-boggling, since it amounts to 2,079 years. The most fundamental research conducted by competent scientists for the verification of the chronological sequence of the pharaohs' reigns in the order of dynastical succession had also proved the necessity of allowing for simultaneous and parallel reigns that would greatly reduce the summary reigning time of the 30 Manethos dynasties. Despite all the scientific discoveries made in this area of Egyptology, the numeric data condition remains extremely unsatisfactory to this day. The situation hasn't improved to the present day. Modern tables date the beginning of the reign of Menes differently to, in quotes, approximately 3,100 BC, unquote, and in quotes, roughly 3,000 BC, unquote, etc. The fluctuation span for this date amounts to 2,700 years. If we consider other opinions, those of the French Egyptologists, for instance, the situation becomes even more complex. Champollion gives the dating as 5867 BC, Lesieur as 5770 BC, Mariette as 5004 BC, Chabas 4000 BC, Mayer 3180 BC, Andrzejewski as 2850 BC, Wilkinson 2320 BC, Palmer 2224 BC, etc. So there's more. The discrepancy between the datings of Champollion and Palmer equals 3,643 years. No commentary is needed, really. We discover that generally, quote, Egyptology, which had poured some light over the perpetual darkness that had covered the ancient age of Egypt, only came into existence 80 years ago. As Chantepie de la Saussure wrote at the end of the 19th century, he also said that, quote, it had been the private domain of a very few researchers. Alack and alas, the result of their research have been popularized in too much haste. Thus, many erroneous views had come into existence, which resulted in the inevitable sobering when Egyptology became a lot less vogue and the excessive trust in the results of the research was lost. To this day, the construction of the Egyptian chronology remains impossible. The situation with the list of kings compiled by Sumerian priests is even more complex. Quote, it was a historical skeleton of sorts, one that resembled our chronological tables, but sadly this list was of little utility. By and large, the chronology of the king's list makes no sense, unquote, according to the prominent archaeologist L. Woolley. Furthermore, the dynastical sequences have been set arbitrarily. We see that the great antiquity ascribed to these lists today contradicts modern archaeological information. Let us give just one example that we can consider representative enough, telling us about the excavations of what we consider to be the most ancient royal Sumerian sepulchres, dated roughly to the 3rd millennium before Christ. Woolley mentions a series of findings of golden toiletry, which, quote, was of Arabic origin and belonged to the early 13th century AD, according to one of the best experts in the field, unquote. Woolley patronizingly calls the expert's mistake, quote, a forgivable one, since no one had thought such advanced art could have existed in the 3rd millennium before Christ. Unfortunately, the development of the entire critical concept and the propagation of the hypercritical current of the late 19th through the early 20th century froze due to the sheer lack of objective statistic methods at the time, ones that could provide for the independent and objective verification of the previous chronological identifications. And as for my comment, I really don't know what archaeological dig I would trust anymore, ever. Section 5. The problem in dating the, in quotes, ancient sources, Tacitus and Poggio, Cicero and Barziza, Vitruvius and Alberti. The framework of the global Scaliger chronology was constructed as a result of the analysis of the chronological indications given by the ancient sources. It is natural that the issue of their origin should be of interest in this respect. Modern historiography manifests the paucity of evidence in what concerns the genesis of such ancient manuscripts. The general observation is made that the overwhelming majority of these documents surfaced during the Renaissance epoch that allegedly superseded the Dark Ages. The discovery of manuscripts often happened under circumstances that forbade the analysis which could allow the critical dating of such findings. In the 19th century, two prominent historians, Hocart and Ross, published the results of their research proving that the famous, quote, ancient Roman history by Cornelius Tacitus was really written by the well-known Italian humanist Poggio Bracciolini, and the publications occurred in the years 1882 through 1885 and 1878. Readers may turn their attention to 21, and there's so much in brackets in this book, it's just not even coverable. That's why I would suggest you go to archive.org to this address. You can see all of the various bracketed references and take a look. That'd be a good idea. Which covers this problem exhaustively. We should just note that we deem the History by Tacitus to be an edited original, that is a partial forgery and not a complete one. However, the events related therein have been misdated and transposed far back in time. The history of the discovery of Tacitus's book really provokes a great many questions. It was Poggio who discovered and published the opuses of Quintilian, Valerius, Flaccus, Asconius, Pedianus, Nonius, Marcellus, Probus, some tractates by Cicero, Lucretius, Petronius, Plautus, Tertullian, Marcellinus, Calpurn, Siculus, etc. The circumstances of these discoveries and their datings have never been related in detail. See more about the history of Tacitus's books in Chronology 1, Chapter 7. In the 15th century, famous humanists such as Manuel Chrysoloras, Gemisto Platon, Bessarion of Nicaea, and some others came to Italy. They were the first ones to familiarize Europe with the achievements of the, quote, ancient Greek thought, unquote. Byzantium gave the West almost all the known, quote, ancient Greek manuscripts. Otto Neugebauer wrote that, quote, the major part of the manuscripts that our knowledge of the Greek science is based upon consists of Byzantine copies made 500 to 1500 years after the death of their authors. According to Scaligerian history, the entire bulk of the classical ancient literature only surfaced during the Renaissance. In most cases, detailed analysis shows us that the obscurity of the literature's origin and the lack of documentation concerning its passage through the so-called Dark Ages leads one to suspect that none of these texts had really existed before the dawn of the Renaissance. For instance, the oldest copies of the so-called incomplete collection of Cicero's texts are said to have been made in the 9th through 10th century A.D. However, one instantly finds out that the original of the incomplete collection, quote, had perished a long time ago, unquote. In the 14th through 15th century, there is a surge of interest in Cicero, so, quote, finally, about 1420, the Milanese professor Gasparino Barziza decided to undertake a rather precarious endeavor of filling the gaps in the incomplete collection with his own writings for the sake of consequentiality. However, before he could finish this volume of work, a miracle occurred. A forlorn manuscript with the complete text of all the rhetorical works of Cicero becomes unearthed in a parochial Italian town by the name of Lodi. Barziza and his students eagerly embrace the new discovery, arduously decipher its ancient, presumably 8th century, script, and finally produce a readable copy. Subsequent copies constitute the actual, quote, complete collection, unquote. Meanwhile, the irrecoverable happens. The original of the collection, the manuscript of Lodi, becomes abandoned since no one wants to confront the textual difficulties it presents, and finally gets sent back to Lodi, where it disappears without a trace. Nothing is known of what happened to the manuscript since 1428. The European philologists still lament the loss. Incidentally, the reverse or so-called Arabic reading of the name Barziza gives tis rub. Without vocalizations, this is close to the consonant root of the name Cicero, Figures 1.28 and 1.29 if it were Hebrew, it would be tzadi rosh in modern Jewish terminology. Figures 1.28 and 1.29 show two ancient miniatures from a book by Cicero that was allegedly published in the late 15th century. In Figures 1.28, Cicero is portrayed from the left, writing the tractate on the Old Age. In Figure 1.29, Cicero is depicted from the right side, penning out the tractate on friendship. We see a typically medieval setting. Cicero and his interlocutors are wearing medieval clothes, which means that the author of the miniatures in the 15th century or later apparently didn't doubt Cicero to have been his historical contemporary. De Vita the Seventh Caesarum by Caius Suetonius is also only available as relatively recent copies. And I just have to say, I really wish more historians and chronologers had names like Smith and Jones. All of them hail back to the only ancient manuscript, in quotes, that is presumed to have been in Einhard's possession in the alleged year 818 AD. His Vita Caroli Magni is supposed to represent a diligent copy of the biographical schemes of Suetonius today. The original document, known as the Fulda manuscript, did not reach our time, and neither did the first copies. The oldest of Suetonius's copies of hypothetically the 9th century text was only brought to light in the 16th century. Other copies are dated to post-9th century epoch in the Scaligerian chronology. The fragments from De Viris Illustribus by Suetonius also appeared very late. The alleged dating of the latest fragments is the 9th century AD. This manuscript was discovered by Poggio Bracciolini in Germany in 1425. The Hersfeld manuscript did not survive. Nothing but several pages from the Tacitus part remained, but about 20 of its copies did. Those were made in Italy in the 15th century. The dating of the, quote, ancient sources was performed in the 16th through 17th century, out of considerations that are perfectly nebulous to us nowadays. De Architectura by Vitruvius was discovered as late as 1497, according to N.A. Morozov. The astronomical part of the book quotes the periods of heliocentric planetary circulations with the utmost precision. Vitruvius, an architect who is supposed to have lived in the 1st to 2nd century AD, knew these periods better than Copernicus the astronomer! ! Furthermore, his error in what concerns the circulation of Saturn differs from the modern value of the period by a ratio of 0.00007. The error ratio for Mars is 0.006, and a mere 0.003 for Jupiter. QV in the analysis We should mark the magniloquent parallels between the books of the, quote, ancient Vitruvius and those of Alberti, the prominent humanist of the 15th century. See figure 1.30. One cannot fail to notice a certain semblance of the names Alberti and Vitruvius, bearing in mind the frequent inflection of the sounds B and V. Alberti, 1414 through 1472, is known as a prominent architect, the author of fundamental theory of architecture that is very similar to the theory of the ancient Vitruvius. As well as the ancient Vitruvius, the medieval Alberti was the author of a voluminous tractate that included mathematical, optical, and mechanical knowledge, as well as from his theory of architecture. The title of the medieval opus of Alberti's The 10 Books on Architecture coincides with its ancient analog by Vitruvius. Nowadays, it is supposed that the ancient Vitruvius had been, quote, his ultimate idea that he emulated in the creation of his tractate. Alberti's volume is written, quote, in an archaic manner, unquote, accordingly. The specialists have long ago compiled tables comparing fragments of the works by Alberti and Vitruvius, which sometimes coincide word for word. Historians explain this fact in the following manner. Quote, all of these numerous parallels unveil the Hellenistic Roman atmosphere that his thoughts evolved in. So the book of the ancient Vitruvius fits into the medieval atmosphere and ideology of the 15th century AD absolutely organically. Furthermore, the majority of Alberti's medieval constructions are, quote, an emulation of the ancient style, unquote. He creates a palace, quote, made to resemble a Roman amphitheater in its entirety. So the leading medieval architect fills Italian towns with, in quotes, ancient edifices. Every time I say ancient, it's going to be in quotes. Just remember that. There's so much extra textual signs and materials here. So I'm sorry about that. Every time I say ancient in these portions, it's going to be in quotes because I'm assuming he's putting it in quotes to criticize this idea. Okay? So with the leading medieval architects fills Italian towns with ancient edifices that are nowadays considered an emulation of the classical age. But this by no means implies they were considered as such in the 15th century. The books are also written in the manner that will be made archaic much later. It is only after all of this, in 1497 AD, that the book of the ancient architect Vitruvius appears occasionally coinciding with a similar book of the medieval Alberti word for word. One feels that the architects of the 14th through 15th century did not consider their endeavors to be an emulation of the classical age. They were the classical age. The emulation theory was to evolve much later in the works of Scaligerite historians who were forced to explain the numerous parallels between the classical age and the Middle Ages. One observes a similar situation with scientific literature. It would be expedient to remind the reader of how the acquaintance of the European scientists with the works of Euclid, Archimedes, and Apollonius occurred, since, as we see, the Middle Ages were the time when the revival of the achievements of ancient science took place. M. Y. Yagotsky, an expert in the history of science, writes that, quote, not a single solitary copy of Euclid's Elements has reached our times. The oldest manuscript we know of is a copy made in 888. No kidding. Oh, with all the threes I was seeing in the last reading, I was wondering if they were going to stay with threes. 3,333, 300, 333. Now we've got 888. For anybody out there who has any knowledge of occultic numerology and why they use certain numbers, I'm sure that 888 would be significant. That was all my commentary. Back to the reading. There is a large number of manuscripts that date from the 10th through 13th century. Figure 1.31 shows a page from a deluxe edition of Euclid's Geometry dated 1457. It contains a picture of a, quote, panoramic view of Rome, unquote. It is most remarkable that the book by the ancient Euclid contains a picture of the medieval Rome and not the ancient one. One can clearly see a Christian Gothic cathedral right in front. The commentators say that, quote, such Christian monuments as Era Coeli are depicted here. One gets a clear implication that Euclid was really a medieval author. I.G. Bashmakova, an expert in the history of mathematics, informs us that even before the publication of the Latin translation of the Arithmetica by the ancient Diophantus, the European scientists, quote, have been using the algebraic methods of Diophantus, remaining unaware of his works, unquote. I.G. Bashmakova assesses the situation as, quote, somewhat paradoxical, unquote. The first edition of the Arithmetica is dated to 1575 A.D. If Ptolemy's Almagest was instantaneously continued by Copernicus, let us remind the reader that the surge of interest in the Almagest's publication immediately preceded the era of Copernicus, QV in detail in Chronicles 3. Diophantus's opus must have been continued by Fermat, 1601 to 1665. The history of both manuscripts and printed editions of the ancient Archimedes follows the pattern already known to us. According to I.N. Veselovsky, all of the modern editions of Archimedes have been based on the lost manuscript of the 15th century and the Constantinople palimpsest that was found as late as 1907. It is assumed that the first manuscripts of Archimedes reached Europe quite late in 1204. The first translation is supposed to have been made in 1269, and the complete text found in 1884. The 19th century. The first printed edition allegedly appeared in 1503, and the first Greek edition only in 1544. The, quote, works of Archimedes entered scientific circulation after that, unquote. On figure 1.32, right here, you can see an ancient portrait of Archimedes from his book Opera, dating to the alleged 15th century. We see a typical medieval scientist in his study. The commentators couldn't fail to have marked this. Quote, the study is represented in the Renaissance fashion. Conical sections by the ancient Apollonius was not published until 1537. Furthermore, quote, Kepler, who was the first to discover the significance of conical sections or ellipses in astronomy, didn't live to see the publication of the complete works of Apollonius. The next 3 books were first published in a Latin translation in 1631. So the body of work of the ancient Apollonius only got to be published in its entirety after the discovery of the objects that this, quote, ancient tractate deals with in Kepler's epoch. By the way, could the works of the ancient Apollonius just be an edited version of the Pole Copernicus? The name Apollonius is almost identical to Polonius, a Pole, a native of Poland, or Polonia. The astronomer Copernicus, 1473 through 1543, was the eminent precursor of the astronomer Kepler, 1571 through 1630. All that material is very dense. Thus, I would suggest anyone who was looking at taking a closer look, examination of these different persons and times that he's listing would read that for yourself because, well, as I said, it's just so dense with people, places, dates, images, and dating images, and various possibilities of time fudging. So, Section 6, Timekeeping in the Middle Ages. Historians discuss the, quote, chaos reigning in the medieval datings, unquote, peculiar medieval anachronisms. The Scaligian chronological version was far from being the only one. It competed with versions that were significantly different. Bickerman mentions the chaos reigning in the medieval datings. Furthermore, the analysis of ancient documents shows us that old concepts of time were substantially different than modern ones. Before the 13th through 14th century, the devices for time measurement were a rarity and a luxury. Even the scientists didn't always possess them. The Englishman Valcarius was lamenting the lack of a clock that afflicted the precision of his observations of a lunar eclipse in 1091. The clocks common for medieval Europe were sundials, hourglasses, and water clocks, or clepsydrae. However, sundials only were of use when the weather was good, and the clepsydrae remained a scarcity. In the end of the 9th century AD, candles were widely used for timekeeping. The English King Alfred took them along on his journeys and ordered them to be burned one after the other. The same manner of timekeeping was used in the 13th through 14th century in the reign of Charles V, for instance. The monks kept count of time by the amount of holy book pages or psalms they could read in between two observations of the sky. For the majority, the main timekeeping medium was the tolling of the church bells. One is to bear in mind that astronomical observations require a chronometer that possesses a second hand, while we learn that even after the discovery and the propagation of mechanical chronometers in Europe, they had been lacking the minute hand for a long time. It has to be said that the ultra-sophisticated chronological Kabbalah developed in the Middle Ages contradicts this imprecision of temporal observation. For instance, the very periods used for measuring time on Earth acquire an entirely different duration when used for measuring the biblical events. Augustine equaled every Genesis day to a millennium, thus attempting to define the duration of the history of humankind. Such an, quote, inherent trait of the medieval historiography as its anachronistic propensity, unquote, it is of importance to us. Quote, the past is described in the same categories as the contemporary epoch. The biblical and the ancient characters wear medieval attire. A medieval moralist ascribes, quote, courteousness, unquote, to the ancient Romans, which was a purely knightly virtue. The epochs of the Old and the New Testament are not put in a direct temporal sequence. The fact that the portals of medieval cathedrals portray Old Testament kings and patriarchs together with the ancient sages and evangelical characters unravels the anachronistic attitude to history like nothing else. In the end of the 11th century, the Crusaders were certain they came to punish the actual executioners of the Savior and not their offspring. This fact is significant enough, and we shall come back to it later on. Modern historians base their observations on the Scaligerian chronology, believing that the medieval authors had, quote, attained a state of great confusion in what concerned both concepts and epochs, due to their alleged ignorance, and that they had confused the ancient biblical epoch with the medieval one. Medieval painters, for instance, kept portraying the biblical and the ancient characters in typically medieval costumes. However, another point of view is also visible, one that differs from the traditional, quote, love for anachronisms, unquote, explanation. Namely, that all of the statements made by the medieval chronographers and artists may have reflected reality, and we consider them to be anachronistic because we follow the erroneous Scaligerian chronology. The Scaligerian chronological version only managed to immortalize one medieval chronological concept out of many. Other versions previously coexisted with the consensual chronology. For instance, it was assumed that the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation in the 10th through 13th century A.D. was the immediate descendant of the ancient Roman Empire that is alleged to have existed in the 6th century A.D. According to the Scaligerian version, mark the repercussions of the discussion that appears very odd in our time. Petrarch made the statement that he was supposed to have based on a number of philological and psychological observations that the privileges granted by Nero Caesar to the house of Austrian dukes in the 13th century A.D. were fake. It needed proof in those days. For the modern historian, the thought that the ancient Caesar and Nero were the contemporaries of a medieval Austrian house of dukes that had only commenced its reign in 1273 A.D., that is, about 1200 years after Caesar and Nero, is naturally a preposterous one. However, as we see, the medieval opponents of Petrarch were of a different opinion, since it needed proof. QV above. E. Priester, making the following observation in the same notorious documents, quote, all the interested parties were perfectly aware that the documents were blatant and shameless forgeries. Such is the modern interpretation of the fact. And nevertheless politely shut their eyes on this circumstance. An abnormally large number of anachronisms that transpose ancient events into the epoch of the 11th through 14th century is contained in the medieval German chronicles and texts. Detailed reference may be obtained from, and then in brackets 469. The reader must be accustomed to believing the famous gladiator fights only occurred in distant ancient ages. This is not the case, however. V. Klasowski, in brackets 389, having told us of the gladiator fights in the ancient Rome, proceeds to add that these fights took place in the medieval Europe of the 14th century as well. For instance, he mentions the gladiator fights in Naples around 1344 AD, which were attended by Johanna of Naples and Andrew of Hungary. These medieval fights ended with the death of one of the fighters, exactly the way they did in ancient times. The more I read through this, the more I suspect that this is not some sort of, I don't know. I certainly wouldn't call it a professional psyop. And why is, without being critical at all to the translator, oftentimes the English that is rendered in this translation is not a very fluent English. So you will oftentimes hear me saying things that seem like they're not following. I'm not using the right tense in words and such, when mostly I'm reading it the way that the words are printed on the page. It happens. And I think for someone to translate such a large volume is a very big deal from Russian into English. But I'm just trying to tell you that it's not all errors that I'm having in looking at the page and reading these words. Oftentimes it is simply the way that it is printed. So, Section 7. The chronology and the dating of biblical texts. The datings of religious sources are virtually woven out of obscurity and confusion. The biblical chronology and datings are of a very vague nature, since they are based on the authority of late medieval theologians. The historians write the following: the true history of the origins of the books comprising the New Testament also fails to concur with the one backed by the Church. The order of the New Testament books that is used nowadays is the direct opposite of the one set by ecclesial tradition. The real names of the authors of medieval books remain unknown. As we shall learn, the consensual point of view about the Old Testament books preceding those of the New Testament also causes many doubts and contradicts the results obtained by modern empirico-statistical dating methods. One should also consider the issue of the age of the biblical manuscripts that have reached our time. They turn out to be of medieval origin. The oldest more or less complete copies of the Greek Bible are the manuscripts of Alexandria, Vatican, and Mount Sinai. All three manuscripts are dated paleographically. That is, with such an ephemeral concept as handwriting style used as a basis to the second half of the 4th century. The Codex language is Greek. The least is known about the Vatican Codex. Nobody knows how the artifact manifested in Vatican around 1475. I agree. The Alexandrian Codex is known to have been given to the English King Charles I by the Patriarch Cyril Lucaris in 1628. The Codex of Mount Sinai was only discovered in the 19th century by K. Tischendorf. So the three oldest codices of the Bible only surface after the 15th century AD. The reputation of their antiquity was created by the authority of K. Tischendorf, who had based his research on the style of handwriting. However, the very idea of paleographical dating apparently implies the existence of a known global chronology of other documents and thus cannot be regarded as an independent dating method in any way. What we know for certain is that the history of these documents can be traced as far back as 1475 AD. In other words, no other more or less complete ancient Greek Bibles exist. Among separate biblical books, the oldest ones are considered to be those of Zechariah and Malachi, dated to the alleged 6th century AD. Also, paleographically, the most ancient biblical manuscripts are in Greek. There are no Hebraic manuscripts of the Bible predating the 9th century AD. in existence, although those of a more recent time, primarily the middle of the alleged 13th century AD, are kept in many national libraries. The oldest Hebraic manuscript is a fragment of the Books of Prophets, and it is dated to 859 AD. One of the two second oldest manuscripts is dated to 916 AD and contains the Books of the Prophets. The other is dated to 1008 AD and contains the text of the Old Testament. However, the first manuscript was dated to 1228 by the scribe. The so-called Babylonian punctuation of letters given here allows this text to be dated by the Seleucid era, which gives us 916 AD. However, there are no serious foundations for such a statement. It is hence possible that the dating was given in years since Christ, in which case the manuscript would belong to the 8th century and not the 10th. The oldest Hebraic document containing the complete Old Testament can be ascribed to the alleged year 1008 AD. It is supposed that the biblical canon was agreed upon by the Laodicean Council in 363 AD, but no edicts of this council remain in existence, and the same concerns the previous councils. The canon was really made official by the New Trident Council called in 1545, the epoch of the Reformation, and continued until 1563. In Figures 1.33, we can see a painting of one of the council's sessions by Titian. And that would be here. A great many books were destroyed by the edict of the Trident Council, the ones considered apocryphal, namely the chronicles of the Judaic and Israeli kings. We shall never be able to read these books, but there is one thing that we can be perfectly certain of. They were destroyed, since they had described history differently from the books approved by the winning faction of Scaligerite historians. We should emphasize that, quote, there were a lot more apocryphal opuses, unquote, than those certified canonical, and that most biblical datings are wholly dependent on paleography, which means that they are based upon a priori chronological knowledge of the Scaligerian school and would change automatically if a chronological paradigm shift occurred. Let us give an important example. In 1902, the Englishman Nash purchased a fragment of an Egyptian papyrus manuscript whose dating cannot be agreed upon by the scientists to this day. The final agreement was made that the text corresponds to the beginning of our era. Later on, after the discovery of the Qumran manuscripts, the comparison of the handwriting styles in both Nash's papyrus and the manuscripts allowed for the determination of a greater antiquity of the latter. Thus, one papyrus fragment whose dating, quote, cannot be argued upon, unquote, pulls a whole lot of other documents after it. Nevertheless, the, quote, dating of the Qumran scrolls provoked major dispute amongst scientists. The dating range was given from the 2nd century and until the epoch of the Crusades. The early AD dating is considered proven after 1962, when a radiocarbon research of the Qumran manuscripts was conducted. However, as we shall mention later on, the radiocarbon method is really unsuitable for the dating of specimens whose age falls into the span of 2 to 3 millennia, since the ensuing datings cover too wide a time range. This may reach as wide a span as 1 to 2,000 years for specimens whose age reaches 1 to 2,000 years. Although 444 in brackets dated the Qumran manuscripts to 68 AD, the American historian S. Zeitlin categorically insists on the medieval origin of these texts. We shall give a more detailed account of matters concerning the biblical manuscripts in Chronology 6. Okay. I'm going to stop here for today. Now, I'm going to wrap this up with some explanations and a bit of commentary. Fomenko provides extensive bibliographical sources in the back. And as he goes through this book, he he brackets them all. Now the thing is, the bracketed bibliographical references are quite often part of what he is saying. So instead of him or the translator writing the text and simply inserting the brackets where that bibliographical source applies, in many instances, that bibliographical reference in brackets becomes part of the text. So let's say, for instance, in this last section, about biblical manuscripts and their earliest datings, he keeps giving a bracketed reference to 444. Well, if you check in the complete bibliography to the 7 volumes, it's all in this first book, the complete bibliography, okay? You'll see under 444, it is Krivelev IA, the excavations in the, quote, biblical countries, Moscow, Sovietskaya Rossiya, 1965. So I think in many examples, he is actually incorporating what would be the title and author by bracketing the numbers, instead of just bracketing the numbers or putting a, let's say a numbered reference to the bibliography in a sort of detached kind of way. It's actually inserted into the text, which makes reading it, for me, the reader, it makes it choppy. Also, the translator, and I'm sure the author, Fomenko, they have a very big vocabulary, and all of this, as you can see even on the screen, is written in 2-column form. That means that, for one thing, the very long words and long and foreign names that I have to pronounce are often split between 2 different lines because of the narrow columns, which can make the reading, again, choppy. And for this reason, it's just suggested by me that for the most part, you're going to get the information that he's relaying. But oftentimes, even if I was the most seamless reader of this stuff, it would be something that you may have to listen to a few times to really get what's going on. And again, my hat's off to the man who translated all of this from Russian into English. But at times, it is the syntax is slightly choppy. Not bad at all. It did just certain forms of certain words are slightly just out of what I would consider typical English syntax. And to illustrate this, all right, I have a friend who is actually assisting me in the Hebrew language project. Her mother is from Russia, grew up in Soviet Russia, told me a couple of things. The first thing is, it was told to me that most Russians in Soviet Russia, when they were taught English, they were taught English incorrectly, so that they couldn't even coherently communicate with Westerners. This, to me, seems to be an obvious part of the plan of the communists, i.e. the Zionists, i.e. the Synagogue of Satan, to keep the Westerners and the Russians separate, lest they unite. So because of a program that lasted from I don't know when till I don't know when, of teaching a poor, incorrect form of English, I would imagine what they did was they taught the syntax incorrectly to them. The communication barriers may still be very concrete in the minds and communications of many people who grew up in Soviet Russia. Furthermore, this same woman told me that her mother, who grew up in Soviet Russia, said that for quite some time, Fomenko's writings were banned. You could not own them or read them. So that's a point of interest as well. Now, in the way of commentary concerning the section that Fomenko just did on biblical manuscripts, here is my bit of interest on that. The funny thing is that if we were talking about manuscripts that related anything other than the premises of the biblical narrative in general, if we were talking about manuscripts that talked about UFOs and space visitors, or manuscripts that talked about hollow earth and a noble people within, or anything else, if there were even fragments of manuscripts that spoke of these things, even in relative terms to one another, those who choose, or let's say they do not want to believe the narrative of the Bible and the God of the Bible and the Messiah of the Bible, they would grab onto those things very tightly and talk about, well, it must be true. I mean, we have these fragments from various places and various times. There has to be something to this. There just has to be. But those same people, if you point out that there are so many full and fragmented copies of the Bible existing in various forms, yes, we have them in Greek, we have them in Hebrew, we have them in Samaritan, we have them in many older languages, Latin, German, there's Ethiopian. It exists in many, many, many different languages spread all over the world with different antiquities, many of them not being able to be dated. And yes, I don't agree that the Dead Sea Scrolls, I do agree that the Dead Sea Scrolls quite possibly were not nearly as old as we're told they are. Absolutely not. But it's amazing because I see all the time a drive and a desire from those who simply do not want to believe the narrative of the Bible. Will look at so many witnesses, such a plethora of witnesses of the Bible, with oftentimes so much agreement in the text. Yes, they have variations. You can go into that. There might be a variation in tense from one text to the other. There may be some word variations from one text to the other, but they all agree on the main source material. We don't have that with anything else. If we were finding that with, I don't care, man, say Hindu texts in various parts of the world, in various languages, in various forms, sometimes chopped up, not complete, so on and so on. People would talk about that endlessly, how amazing that was. But when it's the Bible, all they want to do is emphasize what negatives there are. And I don't find that to be intellectually honest at all. I don't find that to be honest in any way. Because here's the thing. Yeah, I know that a lot of people who believe the report of the Bible are accused of being sort of weak-minded and only relying on a blind faith. The funny thing is, if I saw that if I was given enough hard proof that the Bible was just made up by men and not written by direct inspiration of the God thereof, I would be its harshest critic. Because the false presumption that's oftentimes preached by many who just don't want to believe the Bible is that it's a book of just faith or religion. And the problem with that is that the Bible has enough of history and commonality of message from manuscript to manuscript in wide places, language to language, with manuscripts being observably so different in geography and time written, with such a commonality of the message that you don't need to just have silly, blind faith to say that amongst all, not just religious books or texts of the world, but among all texts of the world, this text still contains by far, not even head and shoulders, but far, far, far more than head and shoulders above the rest, has a veracity to it merely by the frequency of occurrences, of witnesses, of this text. And I have to point that out, because this assumption that those who believe the Bible are going on just blind faith is absurd. It is absurd. And I notice that Fomenko only pays attention to those copies of the Greek and then mentions the oldest Hebrew manuscripts. And you have Aleppo Codex and Leningrad Codex. But there are far more than that. There are Aramaic texts, Coptic texts, Old German texts. There's a lot of texts out there. I mean, a lot. It's ridiculous how much. Just mind-boggling ridiculous how many versions of the text exist. Portions of the Old Testament and the New Testament. And the thing is, I don't have to sit here and defend the veracity of the Bible. In time, I am perfectly confident that the Bible and the God thereof is going to defend the veracity of His Word Himself. But I do have to point that out, because I am a Bible thumper. So, if you choose to, you can just listen to my reading of Fomenko's book and then not listen to the commentary at the end. I am giving all of my listeners the courtesy of saving these kinds of comments till the end, but I certainly will comment at the end. So it is my hope that as we go through and considering all of the various sections of this book that I have read, it's not going to seem as dense and difficult and choppy, because he's right now in this first chapter covering a ton of ground. And when you're covering so much ground in something like this, you're going to have just a plethora of names and dates, and as he did comparisons in dynasties and empires, and showing multiple situations in which it was claimed by accepted chroniclers that certain people were contemporary, that weren't contemporary. This is something that takes a massive amount of information given. As it goes, there will be, in a sense, a whittling down or a greater focus on certain portions of this kind of thing, which I think will be helpful. But as we go through this whole first chapter, it looks like we will have a great density of that kind of material. So hang in there, and I will keep doing this, and I will keep saving commentary till the end, so that any of you that think I'm a horrible person for, always commenting on this with the Bible as my central worldview, well, you can just cut out the end comments if you want, even though I'm not going to always comment biblically at the end. It might actually be just based on the material or secular scientific observations. Who knows? It's my channel. I do what I want. So anyways, I hope you all will join me next time when we start in section 8 of chapter 1. And I hope I'm sorry that YouTube is not allowing for certain smaller viewing options on these videos. I don't really have a lot of control over that, and I'm not super techie. So I would invite anybody who, just wants to take these and download the readings. If you want to cut out the commentary and put it just in the readings form, this is not necessarily, This is not my material. I'm reading the works that A.T. Fomenko and Nosovsky and many others did. So, if you want to do something like that, I mean, feel free. Isn't this the point of social media? That it is really a public utility for us to share information and share ideas and opinions and truths and facts and everything else. So until next time, take care.